I'm Christine and welcome to my knitting room. Today I'm going to show you a fun little project that I discovered on one of the knitting groups. It's called the Cozy Cowl. And as you can see, it is half fabric. This one happens to be flannel and half knit. And it's done in one long loop that you turn and twist and put over your neck for a cute little two-tone cowl. The original designer's name was Laurie Garn. You can find her on the internet if you do a quick search. It's Lauriegarn, and she called it the Cozy Cowl. She has some simple instructions on her blog post, but I noticed that she didn't have a video, so I thought it would be nice to make a little video for my followers. Today I'll be demonstrating on a machine with a ribber. You don't have to have a ribber. If you have a flatbed machine, you'll just make a piece twice as wide and have a side seam to deal with. Or if you have an Addy or a Centro or another one of those circular machines that makes a tube, you can go with that as well. The project takes less than half a yard of fabric, whether it's flannel or fleece, and about 250 yards of a worsted weight yarn. You'll also need a sewing machine to attach the knit and fabric pieces together. And the whole project takes about an hour. Here are some examples that I have made. This one has a nice soft fleece on it with a tube of gray yarn. They look great with a buffalo check plaid. And here's another one that I made with a plaid flannel that instead of a tube, I knitted a textured piece using my ribber, and I'll demonstrate that as well. Okay, my machine's cleaned and oiled, my yarn is wound, let's rock and roll. I'm demonstrating today on a Brother KH260. If you have a different kind of machine, you'll just want to check your manual for your particular settings for your machine. And I am using a Joann's Big Twist yarn. I also like to use Lion Brand Heartland for this project. It's a similar weight and it has a very nice texture. You'll want to do your own swatch, of course, but I happen to know from previous experience that I'm going to be using a tension dial 6 on both my ribber and my main carriage. To make a tube on your machine with a ribber, you're going to be setting up your cast on for full needle rib. In this case, I have 27 stitches on the main bed and 26 stitches on the ribber. And to do full needle rib, I'm going to have to change the pitch, way over here, from P3 to H3. And what that does is it lines the needles up so that they pass next to each other and aren't clashing. If you have a flatbed machine, you can just go ahead and cast on about 54 or 55 stitches, knit your flat piece, and then sew your side seam. But having the ribber makes it really convenient to make the tube. The first thing I'm going to do is cast on with some waste yarn. And do my first zigzag row. Then, of course, we'll hang our cast-on comb. All settings on the carriage were at normal for this part. I'll hang a couple of nice weights. And you should be able to see my zigzag row there. And notice that it is using every needle and not skipping any like you would for a normal rib. Now I am going to do another Now that I've knit one row across, I'm going to set up my carriages for circular knitting. This means pushing in the left part button on the knitter and the right part button on the ribber. What this is going to do is it's going to knit one bed in one direction and not the other, and then it's going to knit the other bed back, effectively making a tube. Now I'm going to knit just an inch or so of this waste yarn. You'll want to do at least 20 passes. And you want to keep in mind that each pass that you make is really only half of the round. So here I'm knitting the top, and here I'm knitting the bottom. I have now set my waste yarn aside, threaded up my main yarn, and reset my row counter to 0. I'm just going to keep the settings as they are, and I am just going to push back and forth for 300 passes on the row counter. That's going to give me about 150 rows. So if you're going to just do a flatbed piece, you can just do 150 rows. I am going to actually get a good workout on my arms here. If you watch carefully, you can see that you are just knitting in one direction on the bottom bed and then knitting in the other direction on the top. You're going to periodically need to move your weights up. So what I like to do is just gently poke the rubber comb through the yarn and then rehang some weights underneath. I did a quick check of my notes and saw that actually it is 350 passes with the 2 carriages. So for your flatbedders, it's going to be about 175 rows. So I have cut my main yarn and re-threaded up my waste yarn, and now we're going to just take it off on waste yarn. Now we come to the sewing part. I have my knitted piece. First we have to calculate how big of a piece of fabric we need. So my knitted piece is 6 inches wide. So if I'm going to want and it's 2 sides, so that's 12 inches. So I'm going to want a piece of fabric cut and sewn in a tube that's going to be 12 inches wide. So that means I need to cut 13-inch wide piece to allow for a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side. My piece is also 17 times 2 is 34 inches long. So I am going to want to make my 13-inch wide by 35 inches long. If you are using a plaid fabric, you do want to make sure that your lines and your plaids are matching up. These are good to go, so now I'm going to cut. Because your knit piece can vary a bit in width, I recommend that you do that piece first and then measure and cut your fabric. Now take your fabric strip, fold it in half right sides together, and again, if you're working with a plaid, match up your stripes, and then we're going to pin from the top and the bottom. We will go down a ways here. And we're going to need to leave a gap for turning. So I want to know where I'm going to stop sewing. I always put a double pin in there because we're going to sew down to here, leave a gap, and then continue on down here. So I have now sewn from here to here and from here to here, and I have my opening, which I'm going to need to turn it later. And now I'm going to attach the knit piece to the fabric. To do that, I am going to feed this in through that opening. I'm starting with the end that's open. I have my waste yarn here. Not going to worry about that until later. And then making sure that this is flat, all nice and flat inside. I'm going to start pinning the flannel to the knit piece. And you got to kind of fiddle around with it with your fingers to make sure it's all laying nice and flat inside. And then you want to make sure that when you sew your seam, and I'm using 1/2-inch seams, that I am capturing the main yarn and not the waste yarn. And we'll use our fingers to kind of ease that all in nice together. Until we have pinned it all the way around. Okay, that's looking good. I'm going to continue to pin all the way around. I am going to also make sure that I am opening up my seam on my fabric, and I will pin that down. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the other end. I've put the other end of the knit piece through the side, making sure there's no twists or folds, and then I'll pin it in the same way. Now that I'm satisfied that I have it pinned nice and evenly, I'm going to sew these two pieces together. It helps if you have a free arm machine like I do, and can sew it just as you would a sleeve. You can still do it if you don't have a free arm. You're just going to have to go inch by inch, and it's going to be a little time consuming. So again, I am making sure that nothing is bunching up. I'm going to get this on here like this. I like to start and end with my seam. I'm going to do a 1/2-inch seam just like I did down the side of my fabric. And off we go. Back tack so it doesn't come out. Hope you can see this. I'm making sure with my fingers that my yarn isn't bunching up underneath where I'm sewing. I usually put the pins no less than an inch apart to avoid that. Now I am back to the beginning. Back tack it to prevent it. I recommend doing a fairly tight stitch with this, no less than 8 to 10 stitches per inch. You want to make sure that all your knit stitches are captured. So now both pieces are sewn, and I took all the pins out, and I'm going to remove my waste yarn. On the top end, that's easy because I can just take the loose end and unravel it. That all came out nice and clean. On the bottom end, where we first cast on, I would have made my life a lot easier if I would have remembered to put some ravel cord in between my waste yarn and my main yarn, but I didn't. I was too excited to make this video for you all. So I am going to have to just cut most of this away. And again, it is waste yarn, and we don't have to worry about it too much. So I'm going to clean up these edges, just causing me a few extra minutes of time. And you can cut and pick away what you don't need. And now comes the magic. I'm going to reach inside of our opening and turn the fabric inside out, pulling our knit fabric through and And look, we are almost there. We have a nice tube. The final step is going to be to top stitch our fabric and close up that opening that we used for turning. So what I like to do is start here near the top, and I'm going to make sure that that seam is nice and flat, and I will start pinning. And you can see how nice that looks. I've matched up my stripes. Very important when you're working with a fabric that has an obvious stripe or plaid fabric. So continuing to work with my fingers to make sure that that is nice and flat. When I get down to the opening here, I'm going to have to kind of finger press a pretend 1/2 inch seam there, and finger press that and match up the edges as if they were seamed. At this point, I'm going to start adding extra pins per inch to make sure that doesn't roll when I'm top stitching it. Finger press. Folding over about a 1/2 inch, just like with my regular seam. And I'll do this all the way until I get to the end. Once I'm satisfied that I have this pinned very neatly, oops, I think I'm going to add an extra pin right there. Now I can go back to the sewing machine and sew a top stitch along this edge. I will probably do it at about 1/4 inch all the way across. That will not only close up this gap where we used space for turning, but it will make this fabric lay nice and flat as well. And here's how you do that interesting waffle weave technique with your ribber. I first learned this technique from Diana Sullivan on YouTube. If you have not discovered her already, look her up. She has wonderful videos. This technique uses a standard 1x1 needle arrangement. I'm using 29 stitches, 1/2 on the main bed, 1/2 on the ribber. I have set my pitch back to P3 so that the needles don't clash. And I am using some Lion Brand Heartland for this one. I know it's a little bit thinner and more flexible. So I am changing my ribber carriages to tension dial 3 on both the top and the bottom. I've cast on my yarn, hung my ribber comb in weights, and now I'm going to set up for the circular rows that you start your ribbing with. So I have pressed my left part button in on the main bed and my right part button up on the ribber bed. And we will knit 3 rows of that and reset the carriage for plain knitting. And now for the fun part. It's really pretty easy. I've set my row counter to 0. I am going to do 2 rows plain ribbing. That's 2 rows with plain setting on both your carriage. After that, I'm going to do 2 rows with tuck, and I'm pressing both tuck buttons in on my main carriage only. And I'm going to do 2 rows. Reset to plain. Do 2 rows. 2 rows of tuck. 2 rows of plain. 2 rows of tuck. 2 rows of plain. And it's really that simple to get that beautiful texture. I'm going to need about 250 rows or so I will be back in a minute. After 250 rows, I'm going to finish off with 2 rows of plain. going to bind this piece off. You can use any method that you like. I'm going to first transfer all of these stitches up to the main bed, and then my personal preference is to take them off on a knitting needle and bind off by hand. You can do it any which way you like. And here you can see that beautiful waffle weave texture that we achieved. It's a lot like when you buy thermal long johns. And it's actually pretty on both sides, so it's going to be appropriate for this project. So as before, I have folded my fabric in half right sides together. I matched up my stripes that are in my plaid fabric here. I have sewn from each end to roughly the middle and left myself a open part for turning. As before, I have insert my knit piece inside the fabric too, making sure that it's not twisted. And what we're going to do differently here is we're just going to sew straight across. Because this is a flat piece done with ribbing technique, I didn't need to use waste yarn. So all I have to do is line up the end of my yarn with the edge of my fabric and then pin across, and I will sew here. And of course we'll do that on each end. Okay, I have sewn across both ends to attach the fabric to the knitting. And then like before, I turned it inside out and did a row of top stitching along the edge to both tidy up the edge and to close my turning hole. And now it's pretty much good to go. I'm going to, of course, apply a little bit of light steam ironing to the fabric portion of both cowls, being careful, of course, not to touch the iron to the knit side. Here we are with the two cowls that have just been completed. The question then becomes, how do you wear it? Well, what I like to do is take the seam where the knitting meets the fabric and put that kind of at the back of my neck. Then with the cowl hanging down, just give it one twist and put that over your head. You can then arrange it any way you like. This is a really versatile piece. It's easy and fun to do. You could do it in a variety of ribber textures. You can even do a crochet piece, as I mentioned before, and any kind of fabric. I have even seen these done in lightweight cotton prints with a nice cotton yarn, also very cute. You can extend the season with those. So I would encourage you to try it. I hope you enjoyed this video and are inspired by it. And if you are, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.